Bene, allora io adesso darei la parola al professor Frank Farnham, che è uno dei ricercatori componenti del centro di ricerca sulla valutazione del rischio per i comportamenti violenti di Londra, che ci parlerà dello stalking e dei personaggi famosi. Sappiamo ormai tutti che il fenomeno dello stalking è stato studiato all'inizio negli Stati Uniti per il fenomeno dello star stalking, perché i primi casi che sono stati attenzionati dalla cronaca, ed è evidente il motivo, sono stati quelli che hanno visto come vittime star del cinema, della musica. John Lennon addirittura è morto per mano del suo stalker. E però man mano che si va avanti nell'analisi del fenomeno si vede che le vittime non sono soltanto persone comuni come per adesso pare, ma anche uomini politici. In Inghilterra la stessa casa inglese, la stessa famiglia reale inglese è stata vittima di stalking. Quindi ce ne parlerà di questo ci parlerà il professor Farnham. Grazie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Before I start, I'd like to thank Professor De Fazio for inviting us to come and speak today, and also thank her for staying up very late last night translating our slides into Italian, which took a very long time. As David James has mentioned, both he and I work at a unit called the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre in central London, which is a joint unit with the Metropolitan Police. And I want to talk to you today a little bit about stalking of prominent or important or public figures. The general content of the talk will really emphasize the importance of mental illness and mental disorder in this group. We're going to talk a little bit about the way that the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre works, discuss types of threat that we encounter, describe some studies or a study around violence against politicians, discuss types of risk, and this has been mentioned by David already, but we're going to perhaps go into it from slightly more detail. I think we won't have time to talk about motivation, but this has already been discussed. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some of FTAC's, or the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre's, results in terms of assessing and treating or obtaining treatment for individuals. So, the focus of the talk really is the threat posed to prominent people in public life from the fixated. And what do I mean by the fixated? I mean, it's a term which probably doesn't translate well, and it has a particular meaning even in English. What we're talking about when we talk about fixation or the fixated is an obsessive preoccupation pursued to an irrational and pathological degree with an individual or with a cause, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In terms of the fixated group, these fixations can be upon pathological obsession or preoccupations with a person involving hostility, resentment, anger, blame, or love and infatuation, two sides perhaps of, or two sides of the spectrum. It can also be obsessions with a place or an institution, and also with a cause, a highly personalised quest for justice, a psychotically driven paranoid state, over-interpreted political concerns where people become overwhelmed by their anger or their interest in political ideas. And sometimes they're really just confused mixtures of all of the above, and we have to think about how to identify those. I want to talk to you a little bit about a study that we did some time ago. This was a study in a journal of psychological medicine that involved evaluating 5,000 case files from the Royalty Protection Police. The database that they provided us with was by no means complete, but we were able to identify 5,000 cases that they had collected over a period of time. And we were interested in looking at people who had made threatening, harassing or inappropriate communications or approaches to the members of the royal family, the English royal, the UK royal family, their residences or public events. And all of the cases were examined for evidence of serious mental illness, motivation, and the types of behaviour that were involved. Now, the take-home message, really, or the bottom line, is that we found astonishingly large amounts of mental illness and mental disorder in this group. 83% showed clear evidence of serious mental illness. Now, you might ask, how can you identify mental illness with such certainty, for example, from a letter or from a communication? And I'm just going to show you some fairly typical examples of the kind of communications that we're asked to evaluate. Dear Majesty, with this letter is proof that I am royalty and rightful King of England. I would like to have my throne. And there's no doubt that this individual is quite deluded. And up until FTAC was constituted, it was difficult for those who were charged with dealing with these sorts of things to know what to do. This is quite a complicated picture sent to the Queen, involving a very complex family tree that the individual sent, essentially showing that they were in line to the throne. But if you look carefully, you can see that there's Prince Andrew on the top right-hand side, and next to him a picture of Hurricane Andrew from the United States. And anybody who's managing to confuse Prince Andrew with Hurricane Andrew has got evidence of some very odd and disordered thinking. It's really strongly suggestive of schizophrenia in this case. This is another one. This is a letter to the Queen. Anytime a letter to the Queen of England starts with the words, "Hello, Mother," it's usually a sign that something isn't quite right. Hello, Mother. I've not as yet had a reply from you to say you received my letters and parcels. It may be that you've been overly busy with the Russian crisis. We're not entirely sure what particular Russian crisis this person had in mind, but the letter shows clear evidence of mental disorder and delusional thinking. This is another one. This is to Prince Charles. God damn it. God damn you, Charles, Prince of Wales. You know that the Catholic Church is a cult, right? You do know that, don't you? Well, it is. And you shouldn't be worshipping the Virgin Mary. She's not the Queen of Heaven. I am. I'm God's wife. And so it goes on, with grandiose, delusional thinking. Just a couple more. Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II of the UK, I watched your speech this morning for the state opening of Parliament, and you mentioned nothing about my presence among you. Shame on you. The self-referential thinking is very interesting and very suggestive of somebody who is psychotic. This is another example. I'm formally accepting the position of Commander-in-Chief in MI6. MI6 is our special security unit. I had accepted this job informally some time ago on the phone, on this telephone number. There are constant deadlines to go to MI5 and MI6 on certain dates. So, I just need to catch up with my slides. We're talking about prominent people in public life. Who does FTAC, or the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre, deal with? Well, we deal with this lot, who are, I'm sure you're probably aware, the UK or the British royal family. But more recently, we've also become involved in offering a service to initially the Cabinet, so the UK Parliament, and the MPs, the members of Parliament within the UK Parliament. We also, well, just on that, we have, we're involved now in rolling out a programme of seminars and teaching sessions for members of Parliament to try and assist them in thinking about their own personal protection and how they might deal with inappropriate communications and harassers. As an aside, we found several years ago when we studied general practitioners, family doctors, that a lot of them were experiencing quite severe levels of harassment and stalking, but on some level they thought it was part of their job, and it was an admission of failure in some way to accept help. And I think that we are seeing something similar with some of our members of Parliament who are struggling to know what to do with this behaviour. And I'm going to show you some results of a small study that we've conducted about that. But we're also involved in providing a service to people who are attempting to breach or enter inappropriately certain sites. That's the government security zone in central London. Those of you who've been to central London, and certainly any of the government offices, will notice that they are becoming increasingly heavily fortified these days, surrounded by concrete barriers, etc. And people who enter that area who are thought to be the kind of people that FTAC should be involved in are assessed. So, what FTAC is, the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre, is a joint unit between the police, our health service, and our Home Office or Interior Ministry. And this is a unique service that's certainly the first of its kind in the UK, where the police and health are joint partners in the service and work together to try and provide an outcome. And I'll tell you a little bit about what sort of outcomes we're talking about in a moment. What we do is we obtain referrals and we then engage in a process of information sharing between the police and health, the joint unit that I'm talking about. Previously, if a police officer had telephoned someone's local doctor or local mental health service, they would not have been able to obtain information. But because we have doctors and nurses working in the unit, the confidentiality rules apply differently, and we're able to obtain some information about those individuals in order to work out the best thing to do. So we engage in a process of joint risk assessment, and then we attempt to liaise with local services and try and divert individuals from the path they're on, perhaps into healthcare or other mental health services, bearing in mind that the vast majority of the people that we are being asked to consider are seriously mentally ill and have either not yet been picked up by local services, local psychiatric services, or have fallen through the care net and are not receiving treatment. So what does FTAC do? We identify threatening mentally ill people through their inappropriate attentions to the prominent. I think VIP or VIP is a misnomer here because we're not dealing with celebrities per se. We're talking about individuals of the type that I've already described who are being offered protection or for whom the government has some duty of care. We attempt to really bring about an intervention from local services. FTAC doesn't go off and take people to hospital ourselves or get involved in people's treatment in that way. But what we do is try to alert local mental health services to the fact that this person from their area is ill and in need of treatment and acting in a threatening way. And it seems clear from the research that we've done that by doing that, we are, beneficially affecting individuals' lives and getting them the treatment they need. And almost as a side effect or a byproduct of that, we're managing the risk that they pose. Because nearly all of the risk assessment with this group of individuals seems to be centred upon their delusional ideas and odd thinking, which is driving their behaviour. And if they receive treatment for their psychosis, their risk seems to reduce. So, what sort of behaviours is FTAC concerned with? Well, stalking, threats, harassment, inappropriate and problematic approaches either to prominent people or to important sites. Inappropriate and threatening communications like letters, telephone calls, emails and faxes. I can tell a little bit about the kind of nature of the problem and some examples of the kinds of things that we do deal with and kinds of things that we don't deal with. So, sources of violent threat, I mean, obviously there's an obvious terrorist source, relatively small numbers, high danger, presumably there aren't many harmless terrorists, and their motives, at least using a security service type framework, are understandable, and security services or government services have a framework to understand how terrorist threat works. This is the last UK politician to be killed by a terrorist, Ian Gow in 1990, 20 years ago, by an IRA bomb. It's quite a famous quote from the IRA, "You were lucky this time, but remember we only have to be lucky once." And that's a picture of one of the buses that were blown up in the 7/7 bombings recently by Islamist terrorists. So, that's a terrorist threat. Clearly there's a criminal threat, standard type criminal problems like kidnapping and other difficulties. But then there are this group of the fixated. There are large numbers of them. Their motives are often quite obscure. Mostly they're harmless, and there's a low rate of violence. I mean, it's clear that they are a relatively harmless group, but a low rate and high numbers represents a significant risk of serious harm in different domains, which we're going to describe. And before FTAC was formulated, the police and security services were rather inundated by large numbers of these kinds of cases that they didn't really have an answer for. So why are they a problem in protection terms? And I think I've already said this, that they don't compute in terms of standard security force risk assessment and protection procedures. There wasn't really a structure for them before. So what we mean by that is that all of the usual, bricks and mortar, concrete barriers, large guns, don't by themselves prevent a sufficient defence against fixated individuals, lone fixated individuals. So what's the evidence that the fixated are a problem? I'll show you another piece of research. That's the fixated research team outside 10 Downing Street. This is a study of attacks on politicians in Western Europe that we published a little while ago. The method really involved choosing a period from 1990 to 2004, and we were focusing on attacks on elected politicians in Europe during that period. We're interested in physical attack, and we excluded Spain because there were too many attacks from ETA. We also excluded attacks from hitmen or assassins or people who were hired to kill. We excluded attacks on property rather than people, and we excluded legitimate forms of political protest, at least in the UK, such as throwing things at politicians like eggs and tomatoes. Yeah. I'm going to show you a video of some of the things that we wouldn't be interested in particularly, just as a bit of light relief. This Tony, our Prime Minister, or ex-Prime Minister, answering questions in the House of Commons when a member of the public threw some white powder at him. In our view, these aren't attacks. I mean, you know, they may represent a crime, but in the UK, politics is a contact sport, and these sorts of things are just part of what happens. Okay. So, let's go back one. That was our method. There were 24 attacks in total, involving 20 national politicians, 2 local assemblies, and 2 mayors of capital cities. And these were serious incidents, often involving homicide. Of the injuries involving local assemblies across Europe, 22 people were killed, 34 injured. Of the remainder, there were 3 deaths and 8 serious injuries. 11, there were no serious injuries sustained, but that was really by luck. Things like rifle shots, which went amiss, or a Molotov cocktail that didn't go off, and 2 knife attacks that didn't end up with injury. Of the 23 cases with known assailants, 13 of them were mentally disordered, with 9 suffering from schizophrenia, 1 with a condition called delusional disorder, which is really similar to schizophrenia, 1 with significant depression, and 2 with a personality disorder. There are also warning behaviours, which is obviously the relevant point for us, that there were significant amounts of warning behaviour. 11 out of the 24 cases show some type of warning behaviour, and often it wasn't subtle or minimal. They were very obvious warning behaviours. Posters, newspaper advertisements, attempted lawsuits against the government before the incidents occurred. One person tried to set fire to themselves in front of the victim's workplace before they then committed their act of violence. Often wrote chaotic and deluded letters to politicians and to the police, threatening letters, leafleting the public, that sort of thing. And I just want to tell you that this slide shows that the things that were associated with death and serious injury were also really associated with warning behaviours. And they were things like evidence of a mental disorder, definitely being psychotic, definitely being deluded, and being a loner. The one thing that wasn't significantly associated with either were people whose grievances or attacks were politically motivated. A couple of examples. I'll just read this out slowly. Adelheid Streidel had been told as early as 1978 of the existence of underground killing factories. Thousands of people were abducted from their beds and slaughtered, their body parts being sewn together to create new beings, with leftovers being turned into sausages and sold off in butcher shops. She complained over many years about these obviously psychotic ideas. Years of written complaints and demonstrations, and then Jesus told her to kill a politician as no one was taking any notice, and she attacked Oscar Lafontaine in April 1990. Another one. Dieter Kaufmann believed that state transmitters were beaming into his body a mixture of pain and insatiable sexual lust. He twice tried to take the state to court about this. He complained to his MP and other agencies repeatedly for about 7 years. 7 years. Eventually became convinced that self-help was his only chance, and he attacked Wolfgang Schäuble and paralysed him, leaving him in a wheelchair. This is an example which is closer to home for those of us in the UK. Mr. Ashman, who is the man on the bottom left, was a fairly successful businessman with a wife and children who gradually socially declined over a period of time and became increasingly angry about the loss of his job. He turned up to his Member of Parliament's offices between 50 and 100 times and was described as being rambling and incoherent and paranoid. He'd also written several letters. Eventually, he attacked Nigel Jones, who was his MP, and that's the man with the defence injuries there to his hand. But he killed Andrew Pennington, who was Nigel Jones's assistant, by running him through with a samurai sword. That was in January 2001. So what do these cases have in common? The perpetrators were all mentally disturbed. They're fixated on a highly personalised quest for justice. There were warning behaviours, but there was no system to assess the warning behaviours. And they were potentially preventable, we think. This is a quote from Park Dietz and Martel from the States. They produced some research in 1989 and have recently produced a commentary to a paper that we published. Every instance of an attack on a public figure by a lone stranger in the United States, for which adequate information has been made publicly available, has been the work of a mentally disordered person who issued one or more pre-attack signals in the form of inappropriate letters, visits, or statements. So their findings seem to resonate really with and accord with the findings from FTAC. Just want to tell you briefly about some research with our national politicians, our members of Parliament. We sent a questionnaire to all of the members of Parliament and our peers, our House of Lords, to question them about whether they'd experienced any stalking or harassment. This is the first phase of the research, and we got about a third response rate. About a third responded to the first questionnaire. Essentially what I want to say is that about 80% of the people who responded had experienced some kind of problematic behaviour. And nearly a fifth of the ones that responded had experienced violence and hadn't really been sure what to do about that, whether they should be reporting it, who they should be talking to. And these are our members of Parliament. These are not members of the public. I'm not going to go through all of those, but about half had reported people behaving alarmingly, worryingly at their offices, their local offices. About a quarter had experienced people interfering with property. 15% of them had been followed. Lots of inappropriate communications and emails. And interestingly, I think a fifth of them had encountered spurious legal action where fixated individuals had stalked them by taking out legal action which was groundless and had no basis. So it seems to us that there's a significant problem there. Up until recently, there hadn't really been a way of dealing with that, and we're encouraging our members of Parliament to report these sorts of cases through FTAC so that we can see whether or not there are avenues for us to consider them. Well, I'm just going to, David mentioned this, I think, and I'm just going to sort of finish off by talking a little bit about, when we talk about assessing risk of what? FTAC is a joint unit. It involves 2 senior police officers and 6 constables, about equivalent of 2.5 consultant psychiatrists' time a week, and 3 community psychiatric nurses, senior mental health nurses who are involved in that process of looking at the material that comes through and formulating a plan. But when we talk about risk, what do we mean? Well, there's violence, but as we said, the base rate of that is very low. But there are other more kind of common domains of risk, like persistence, escalation, psychological damage or social damage, and disruption to public events. Violence is obviously fairly straightforward. This is a recent example of a radicalized Islamic woman in London who stabbed her local MP at his surgery because he supported the Iraq War. I think it's common knowledge or in the public domain that she probably doesn't have a mental illness, but there's something odd about this woman who was studying for a degree and was at a prominent UK university and was down to get a first-class honours degree, who, following watching some videos on the internet, became radicalised and decided to stab her MP. She received she's just been sentenced and has received a life sentence. It's not only the prominent people who are at risk. This is a picture of, a sanitised picture really, of the Queen's Day incident that occurred in 2009 in the Netherlands, where a man who it seems likely did have some significant mental health problems wanted to attack the royal family in their bus and ended up crashing through a public area, killing 12, we think, I can't remember exactly, but killing 12 members of the public. And there's a risk of persistence. This is a slide that was created by one of our police officers. This is one person's activity over a period of time. And if you look there, I mean, the central point is her mobile phone and landline. She managed to phone New Scotland Yard 146 times over 54 days. She phoned the Metropolitan Police Commissioner 317 times over 70 days. Various other groups, tying up lots and lots of time and lots of resources. This is, I think, a very good demonstration of persistence. This is a book written by one of our FTAC subjects, Persecuted by MI5 Security Service, Volume 1. You'll be pleased to know there's also Volume 2, which we haven't got hold of yet. Volume 1 is an A4-sized book that's this thick and contains nothing really but very odd writings and paranoid rants. This is page 406 of 598. On the left-hand side, those numbers are telephone numbers or fax numbers for members of Parliament. So all of those numbers down the left-hand column are fax numbers for members of Parliament. And if you see carefully on the right-hand side, every time you see a Y, that's a yes, and that signifies a success when he was successfully able to fax his 80-page document through to that fax number. So this man managed to successfully tie up the whole of the United Kingdom government fax service over many weeks. He's quite famous in his own way, and as we're in Italy, I thought I'd mention that an opera has been written about him. Those are the various acts of the opera. I thought Act 4, Paranoia, and Act 5, Sulpiride, which is an antipsychotic medication, were quite interesting. There's also fear and distress. Michael Fagan is quite famous in the UK for managing to enter the Queen's bedroom in 1982. He'd heard the Queen commanding him to come and see her. She told him he was the son of Prince Philip and a reincarnation of Hitler, and that the Queen was in love with him eternally and for all eternity. He apparently wanted sex with the Queen and had said rather worryingly that if she were an ordinary housewife, he would have just gone and raped her. He believed that people were reading his thoughts and that the Queen had told him to cut his wrist by means of a thought wave. I mean, the story is terrible, really, because he managed to break his way into Buckingham Palace, sat on the Queen's bed. Her security officer, who was meant to be outside, was off taking the corgis for a walk. And she constantly pressed her alarm buzzer, but it hadn't been connected. She ended up trying to calm him down by offering him a cigarette, and eventually a security officer came back noticed there was something wrong, and came back in. As you can imagine, this caused quite a lot of difficulty. That's Mr. Fagin now. He's done quite well out of it over the years. Do we have time for, how much time do we have? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? I'll just show some more videos, I thought. This is another example of sort of fear and distress. Oh, it's a bit small. You can see the look on Reagan's face when the object is thrown at him, and an individual has managed to get through his security, who's then bundled away. And sort of interference with events or functions. This is a man called Aaron Barshak, who set himself up as a comedy bin Laden and managed to con his way into Prince William's birthday party, where several members of the royal family were. This is another example of disruption. This is a Grand Prix. This is Father Horan, who is a defrocked Catholic priest, who believes he has a message, the details of which I won't bore you with, but he feels it's very important to communicate his message, if at all possible. Okay. This is Father Horan again. Perhaps I think this is terrible. This man is winning the Athens Marathon. I mean, years of training. He recovered, but I think he came second. So, just to reiterate what David had spoken about in the last talk, when thinking about the risks that these individuals pose, when dealing with public figures, we need to add in escalation and disruption to the existing domains of violence, persistence and recurrence. And I think it's important to remember the psychological, physical and social damage that these individuals are doing to themselves predominantly, but also to their victims. These are just some of our publications, which I won't bore you with. Just one brief 2 minutes and then we'll be finished. This is just slightly complicated slide showing the outcome of the first 100 cases that FTAC dealt with. Really what I want to point out to you is the very large section of the pie represents the fact that half of these patients, these people, were admitted to psychiatric hospital under sections of our Mental Health Act. I mean, they were really very disturbed individuals indeed. And another quarter were taken on by local mental health services. So, in other words, very significant amounts of mental disorder. I've already spoken about that. That's us, well, that's one of my psychology colleagues winning an award at the Association of Chief Police Officers Excellence in Policing Award a while ago. That's FTAC, outside number 10. And that's our website, the Fixated Research Group. And that's me finished, thank you.
Al professor Farnham e ci rimane qualche minuto se qualcuno di voi ha delle domande da porre o dei chiarimenti da chiedere, possiamo approfittarne. Beh, allora, chiudo io con una battuta dicendo che potremmo ringraziare il professor Farnham regalandogli l'immagine del telegiornale che riprendevano Berlusconi colpito dalla statuetta della Madonnina, così potrà integrare la sua ricerca. Okay. Allora, ci vediamo, adesso c'è la pausa, ci vediamo qui puntuali alle